The reading and reflection of a Treatise of Affliction by Thomas Case. This was first published in 1836. I'm going to be reading about 10-minute sections of this. So let's get to this. Correction, instruction, the rod and the word. Psalm 94:12. Blessed is a man whom you chasten. So think about chasten, think about discipline. O Lord, and teach him out of your law, which will be the word of God. This psalm, having no title, makes it difficult to determine when or by whom it was written. It was probably by David during a time when he and the other godly people were under severe and bitter persecution by Saul and others of his bloody and hypocritical faction. So what he's saying right here is he's saying that, don't know if David wrote this. The thing about David is that David, most of his psalms were written when he was on run from Saul. Saul was jealous, did not want David to become king. But David had been anointed the next king of Israel. But whenever David was out and he was in affliction, that's when he was writing psalms. We don't have any psalms written by David when he was in the palace. Matter of fact, when he was in the comfort of his palace, that's when he fell into his greatest sin with Bathsheba, whenever everything was comfortable and everything was going easy. Just something to think about. Briefly, in the psalm, the prophet does these three things. First, he appeals to God for vengeance on the persecutor, describing them by their pride, profanity, intemperate virulence of speech, cruelty and bloody practices, and finally, their atheistic security. Second, he turns to address the enemies, endeavoring to convince them of the brutishness and folly of their actions, which is the mother and nurse and the other impieties charged against them. He does this with a threefold argument. Number one, the power and skill of God in creating the organs of hearing and seeing in men. Number two, the sovereignty of God and the righteousness of his judgment, which he executes in the world. Number three, his wisdom and knowledge in endowing man with such an excellent intellectual faculty by which even the creature itself is able to attain to admirable degrees of knowledge. Third, he labors to comfort the godly against all the pressures and persecutions under which they groan and languish. The first argument the psalmist uses for this purpose is in the text, namely the sweet fruit which is to be gathered from the bitter root of affliction. The root is indeed bitter, but the fruit is sweet, even divine instruction, which therefore is no longer to be esteemed as a punishment, but as a blessing. So what Thomas Case is saying right here is he's saying that we should be able to realize, we should have enough spiritual maturity to know that whenever even the bitter root, the worst things in our life, that God can bring something good. He can bring sweet fruit out of that in his time. Makes me think of Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those that love him, to those that are called according to his purpose. Man, we get to the point where we can see even in the bitter root, we know God's going to bring some sweet fruit in time. That is a wonderful thing right there. So he goes back, he repeats that psalm, looks at that psalm again. This being the subject I intend to insist upon, I shall, without any more ado, contract it into this doctrinal point of observation. Here it is. Here's his, like his thesis point right here. That man is a blessed man whose chastisements are joined with divine teachings, or it is a blessed thing when correction and instruction go together. The rod and the word make up a complete blessing. If we get to the point where we can see that and understand that, we'll be doing good. I shall take chastisements here in the broadest sense for all kinds of degrees and sufferings, whether from God, man, or Satan, whether suffering for sin or sufferings for righteousness' sake. And for the doctrinal part of this point, I shall endeavor these four things. Number one, to show you what lessons God teaches his people through chastisements. Number two, what the natural and properties of divine teachings are. Number three, how correction tends toward these teachings, or how God uses affliction to carry on the work of instruction in the hearts of his people. Number four, to lay down the grounds and demonstrations of the point, or considerations to prove the happiness of the man who God is pleased to teach through his corrections. I begin with the lesson which God usually teaches his people in a suffering condition. Among many which may fall within the experience of the suffering saint of God, I shall observe 20 distinct lessons. Once I have presented these at length, I will then condense them into 3 summary and comprehensive instructions, which will contain the essence of all. So we make our way all the way through that. We will have a great framework for affliction, for suffering in this world. Number 1, the first lesson which teaches through affliction is compassion towards those who are in a suffering condition. Truly, we are very prone to be insensitive to our brethren's sufferings when we ourselves are at ease in Zion. This insensitivity arises partly from the sensuality inherent in our natures. Reigning in carnal men and dwelling even in the regenerate, we become so attached to the creature comforts we possess that we quench the tenderness and sense we ought to have for the mercies and hardships for others. Additionally, self-love's delicacies make us unwilling to sour the enjoyments of our own comforts with a bitter taste of others' afflictions. There is also a sluggishness and torpor of spirit that makes us unwilling to rise from the bed of ease and pleasure to inquire in the state of our brethren, whether abroad or at home. As the apostle says in another context, we are willingly ignorant, content to be strangers to the miseries and calamities. In one way or another, even Christians, and those truly deserving of the name, are more or less guilty of the sin of the Gentiles, without natural affection, unmerciful, lacking compassion and mercy. Thus, you may find that one reason God sent Israel into Egypt was to soften and melt their hard hearts into compassion toward strangers and captives. Therefore, when God ended their captivity, one of the first lessons he reminded them was, "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger." Though expressed negatively, according to the rule of interpreting the commandments, it includes all the affirmative duties of mercy and compassion. The motive follows, "For ye know the heart of a stranger." How did they come to know it? "Seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." As if God had said, "I know you had a heart of iron and bowels of brass, lacking compassion and mercy. Therefore, I sent you into Egypt, so that by the cruelty of the Egyptians, your hearts might be tendered. By experiencing your own sufferings and miseries, you might learn to always empathize with the anguish and agonies of strangers and captives. Whenever you see a stranger in your land, you may say, 'Here is a poor sojourner, an exile. I will surely have mercy on him and show him kindness, for I have been a stranger and a bondslave in Egypt. I know by experience the fearful, trembling, bleeding heart he carries in his own bosom.'" So what Thomas Case is saying right here, he said, God sent the nation of Israel into Egypt to teach them many things. But one of the primary things he wanted to teach them is to be compassionate towards others. That they had been slaves and not to enslave other people. They've been mistreated and not to mistreat other people. So, the first thing I see from Thomas Case in the Treatise of Affliction, our first reading right here, is how important our afflictions are in teaching us to be merciful and compassionate towards everyone else. We are all connected through the power and the Spirit of God to everybody around us. And how we treat them matters a lot to God.